Have you ever noticed how the smartest person you knew didn't fall behind? They just went silent. It's that friend from college who asked the sharpest questions, the coworker who saw problems before anyone else did. One day they stopped replying. Their profiles went dark. No goodbye, no explanation, just absence. And you probably told yourself a safe story. They burned out. They couldn't handle pressure. They failed somehow. But notice how quickly that story calms you. Because the alternative is uncomfortable. What if they didn't lose? What if they stepped away on purpose? Think about the last time you felt the urge to disappear, not to rest, to actually withdraw, to stop explaining yourself, to stop playing a role you never agreed to. You didn't call it intelligence, you called it exhaustion, or confusion, or a phase. But what if that urge wasn't weakness at all? What if it was clarity arriving quietly? Here's the frame shift. Don't treat disappearance as collapse. Treat it as a response, an experiment. When the environment punishes certain traits, organisms don't always adapt outwardly. Sometimes they retreat inward. Essential versus noise, expression versus performance, freedom versus comfort. One path keeps you visible, the other keeps you intact. And the cost of choosing wrong shows up slowly. Carl Jung noticed this pattern long before social media made vanishing suspicious. When the pressure to become acceptable grows too high, the psyche doesn't argue, it exits. Jung didn't just write about this, he lived it. He withdrew to a stone tower he built with his own hands, no audience, no credentials, just silence and work. Not because he broke, because something in him refused to be diluted. Look at how often this repeats. Grigori Perelman solved a problem that haunted mathematics for a century. Then he rejected the prize and walked away. Bobby Fischer mastered the world of chess, then vanished into isolation. Emily Dickinson barely left her room while reshaping literature. These aren't accidents, and they aren't the same as failure. They're exits from a system that rewards visibility over depth. Here's the uncomfortable part. Society doesn't push out the loud and shallow. It exhausts the precise, the original, the ones who see too clearly to play along forever. If you've ever felt like participating costs you more than it gives back, that's not arrogance, it's friction, and friction always leaves a mark. So try this experiment. Instead of asking why intelligent people disappear, ask what they are escaping from. Instead of assuming something went wrong, ask what finally went right. Comfort keeps you inside the game. Freedom often looks like withdrawal from the outside. And the more you think about it, the harder it is to unsee. Because if disappearance is not failure but strategy, then the question changes. Not why did they leave? But what would happen if you stopped pretending you don't understand the impulse yourself? And what that might cost you, or save you, if you followed it just a little further. Watch how people talk about normal life. The same goals, the same phrases, the same fears dressed up as opinions. You've heard them so many times they start to sound like your own thoughts. And maybe that's the first uncomfortable moment. Because if you slow down and listen closely, you might notice how few of those thoughts you actually chose. You buy what you were shown. You chase what was praised. You repeat ideas you never examined. And here's the quiet risk most people never face. They truly believe this is independent thinking. It feels personal. It feels earned. But it's mostly inherited. A mental playlist that started long before you were aware enough to press stop. Jung noticed this pattern everywhere. People living inside a shared script, convinced it was their personality. Same reactions, same ambitions, same fears. Not because they agreed, but because deviation felt dangerous. Comfort versus freedom. blending in versus standing apart. And most never test that line. Now shift the frame. Treat your thinking like an experiment, not an identity. What happens if one assumption is wrong? Just one. What if a belief you defend daily was installed, not discovered? That question alone already separates people, and this is where things get tense, because some people can't stay inside the script. They notice cracks. They question phrases everyone else repeats automatically. They sense that what's called reality is often just consensus with better marketing. And the moment you see that, you don't become wiser. You become dangerous. Not in action, in presence. Here's the part no one warns you about. When you meet someone stronger, you might admire them, richer, maybe envy. But someone who thinks more clearly than you? That hits differently. Their words don't attack you. Their existence does. They don't argue. They reveal. And the mind reads that as threat. This isn't metaphor. When people feel intellectually exposed, the brain reacts as if it's under attack. Fear systems activate, defenses come up, jokes turn sharp, labels appear, arrogant, difficult, problematic. Not because the ideas are wrong, but because they're precise. Precision leaves nowhere to hide. An intelligent person becomes a mirror, not a teacher. A mirror. And most people don't hate mirrors. They hate what mirrors show when they're not ready, so they protect themselves the only way they know how. They reject the reflection. History is full of, this pattern. Thinkers punished not for being false, but for being right too early, too clearly, too publicly. The crime was not error, it was exposure. And once you see this, another question opens that doesn't close easily. If clarity triggers resistance, then withdrawal starts to make sense. Silence becomes strategy. Distance becomes self-preservation. Essential versus noise. Again, speak and be attacked, or step back and stay intact. Neither option is comfortable. Both cost something. So here's the open loop you might not want but can't ignore. If intelligence threatens the group more than ignorance, what does that mean for how visible you should be? And if you've felt pressure to shrink, soften, or stay quiet just to keep peace, was that weakness, or was it your instincts working ahead of your explanations? Because this isn't the conclusion, it's the setup. And the real question hasn't even been asked yet. You've seen this happen in real time. You say something slightly complex, not provocative, just precise. The room goes quiet. Someone clears their throat. Then a joke appears, or the topic shifts. Later, you point out a small inconsistency everyone skipped over. You're told you're being negative. You ask one deeper question. The conversation doesn't argue back. It escapes. That moment is easy to ignore. Most people do. But once you notice the pattern, it becomes hard to sit comfortably inside it. Here's the uncomfortable truth most never test. When people meet thinking they can't keep up with, they don't try to follow it. Their mind switches modes, not curiosity, defense. The goal becomes simple. Reduce the threat. And the threat isn't your idea, it's your presence. Now change the frame. Don't treat this as miscommunication. Treat it like translation under pressure. Every normal interaction becomes work. You're constantly converting. You think in systems. They hear single examples. You see patterns unfolding. They want fixed answers. You speak in likelihoods. They demand certainty. So you compress, you trim, you flatten, you remove the sharp edges before anyone feels exposed. At first, it feels polite, strategic, necessary. But here's the risk no one warns you about. You're not just simplifying your words. You're training your mind to operate below its natural range, and the mind adapts fast. Use it beneath capacity long enough, and it doesn't stay sharp. It shrinks to fit the room. Essential versus noise, again. Expression versus acceptance. One keeps you connected, The other keeps you intact. This is where the loneliness creeps in, not the absence of people, the absence of resonance. You're surrounded by conversation, yet none of it touches what actually matters to you. And over time, something worse happens. You stop finishing thoughts. You abandon questions halfway. You catch yourself choosing silence, not because it's wise, but because explaining feels too expensive. Jung knew this terrain well. His ideas moved in layers most people weren't willing to climb. So he stopped translating, not publicly, privately. He withdrew, built with his hands, worked alone. People watching from the outside called it collapse, breakdown, retreat. But look closer and the pattern flips. He wasn't losing his mind, he was protecting it. Here's the experiment hidden in plain sight. What happens when you stop compressing yourself for the room? When you refuse to shrink your thinking just to maintain comfort? One path keeps you socially smooth. The other keeps your mind alive. Both come with costs. One just hides them better. And that leads to the question most people avoid because it doesn't have a safe answer yet. If clarity keeps isolating you, is the problem your thinking? Or the environment demanding you dull it? And if sanity means adapting to what surrounds you, what does it mean when the surroundings reward noise and punish depth? Hold that tension. Because the real strategy doesn't start with withdrawal or confrontation. It starts with deciding where your mind is allowed to operate at full strength. And we haven't even reached that part yet. It usually starts quietly. You're mid-conversation, nodding at the right moments, shortening your thoughts before they leave your mouth. Again, you notice how often you do it, how natural it has become to compress yourself just to keep things moving. And one day, a simple question slips in, almost by accident. Why am I doing this? What am I actually getting back? Sit with the answer for a second, because it's uncomfortable. You're not gaining depth, not growth, not even real connection. You're performing. And the return on that performance is close to zero. No progress, no relief, just fatigue. That's when something shifts, not emotionally, strategically. You stop explaining, you stop translating, you don't argue, you withdraw. This isn't collapse, it's clarity. Translation exhaustion has a limit. And when it's reached, the mind doesn't negotiate. It exits. Here's a frame most people miss. Think of the version of yourself you show publicly as a tool, not your identity. A mask designed for acceptance. For most people, that mask fits closely enough. The difference between who they are and who they present is small, comfortable. But for some, the distance keeps growing. The mask must be simple, certain, agreeable, predictable, and the real self is none of those things. Now imagine wearing that mask all day, hiding questions, softening observations, pretending you don't see patterns that are obvious to you, not once, repeatedly, day after day. That's not social skill, that's strain. And strain always collects interest. Picture a meeting, someone lays out a plan. You see 5 flaws immediately? Not theoretical, practical. You've seen this fail before. You remember what happened the last time you spoke up? The looks, the labels, too negative, not aligned, difficult, so you stay quiet. The plan moves forward. You already know how it ends. And something subtle happens inside you. You don't explode, you don't protest, you disconnect. This scene repeats. Dozens of times a month. Hundreds of times a year. Each time you choose acceptance over truth. Each time the mask stays on a little longer. Until one day another uncomfortable thought appears. You can't clearly remember who you are without it. Not dramatically, just slowly. The edges blur. Here's the experiment hiding inside that discomfort. What happens when you stop defaulting to performance? When you notice how many hours your mind spends acting normal instead of thinking freely? Comfort versus freedom again. One keeps you socially safe. The other keeps you internally coherent. You can't fully have both, and pretending otherwise is part of the exhaustion. There's practical value here, even if it doesn't feel comforting yet. The moment you see where the drain actually is, you stop blaming yourself for needing distance. Withdrawal stops looking like avoidance and starts looking like maintenance. Essential versus noise. Preservation versus approval. But this is only the first layer. Because once you stop wearing the mask automatically, another question opens that doesn't resolve quickly. If disappearing restores clarity, how visible should you really be? And if you've been performing for years, what parts of you have been waiting quietly underneath, untouched? That's where this goes next. And that's where it starts to get interesting. At some point, it clicks that this isn't just effort. It's a second job. A full extra shift where you smile, soften, agree, pretend. You go home tired. Not from work, but from acting like someone smaller than you are. And one day, you notice you can't do it anymore. Not dramatically, just quietly. So you pull back. Not to disappear forever, to remember who you were before the performance started. This is where the frame changes. Don't call it escape. Treat it like reconstruction. When Jung stepped away, he didn't run from people. He removed the pressure to be simplified. He built an environment where he could think at full depth without interruption, stone by stone. Not symbolic, practical. Because some minds only work when the noise stops. Here's the uncomfortable part that usually comes next. Even when you say nothing, people react to you. You enter a room and something shifts. You haven't criticized anyone. You haven't claimed anything. Yet tension appears. Labels arrive. Arrogant, difficult, pretentious. And it feels unfair because it is. But it's also predictable. Think of this as an experiment, not a judgment. Notice what happens when your presence alone makes others uneasy. Their thinking slows. Their shortcuts become visible. Their confidence thins. Instead of facing that discomfort, they redirect it. Not inward, toward you. You become the explanation for feelings they don't want to examine. This is the strange paradox. You're accused without acting, attacked without speaking. Not because you did something wrong, but because you revealed something unintentionally. Essential versus noise again. You stay authentic and absorb projections, or you dull yourself and regain comfort. Neither option is clean. If you've ever been called arrogant when you were simply precise or superior when you were just calm, this isn't confusion, it's displacement. You didn't create their reaction, you triggered it. And managing that reaction becomes exhausting fast. You're not debating ideas anymore, you're managing other people's defenses just to exist in the same space. There's another layer that makes this heavier. Once you see these patterns, they don't fade. Conversations become predictable. You hear the response before it's spoken. The joke, the judgment, the deflection. And predictability does something dangerous to an active mind. It drains curiosity, it kills engagement, it makes participation feel pointless. This is where many people misread the withdrawal. They think it's sensitivity or avoidance. But it's neither. It's pattern saturation. When everything becomes obvious, staying feels like repeating the same scene with different actors. So the open question isn't whether disappearing is right or wrong, it's this. If staying means constant projection and shrinking, and leaving restores clarity, what is the real cost of being seen? And if you already know how most interactions will end, what kind of environment would actually let your mind breathe? because understanding this doesn't end the story, it sharpens it. And what comes next isn't isolation, it's strategy. You start noticing it before people even speak. The pause, the posture, the familiar rhythm of what's coming next. You already know the reaction before it happens. Not because you're cynical, because you've seen the pattern too many times. Most conversations aren't thinking, they're execution. Social scripts running on cue. Sit through another political debate and watch it unfold. Same phrases, same moral certainty, different faces, or a relationship talk where the advice sounds copied from the same book, the same podcast, the same clip, and a quiet thought hits you. I've already had this conversation not once, dozens of times with people who all believe they're saying something new. That realization lands hard, because an active mind doesn't crave agreement, it craves surprise, new angles, unexpected connections, something that bends your thinking. And once you see how predictable most human behavior is, that fuel disappears. The room feels flat. The exchange feels finished before it starts. Now shift the frame. Don't call this boredom. Treat it like data. Intelligence feeds on novelty, on friction, on ideas that resist. When behavior becomes scripted, engagement drops, not emotionally, mechanically. You're not superior. You're understimulated. This is why some people quietly choose books over gatherings, old thinkers over new acquaintances, not out of arrogance, out of necessity. A dead philosopher can still shock you, still challenge you, still break a mental pattern. The average dinner conversation can't. It follows, rails. You know where it ends. Here's the uncomfortable pivot. This isn't accidental. Society isn't built to reward deep thinking. It's built to maintain balance, stability over truth, comfort over growth, familiar stories over disruptive questions, and intelligence threatens all of that without trying. It exposes weak logic. It unsettles hierarchies. It asks questions that don't come with easy answers. So watch how the system responds. Not openly, subtly. No one says, "We need you to think less." They say you're intense, not a good fit, overanalyzing, difficult. The message is always the same, just softened. Adjust yourself, or step aside. This is where another experiment becomes unavoidable. Notice how new ideas are treated at first, laughed at, dismissed, minimized. Not because they're wrong, but because they're unfamiliar. The mind prefers known errors to unknown truths, even when the truth is better, especially when it's better. Once you see this, predictability becomes suffocating. You know which ideas will be rejected, which questions will be avoided, which insights will be delayed until they're safe. And that predictability drains something essential from you: curiosity, momentum, desire to engage. So the real question isn't why intelligent people step back. It's why anyone would stay fully exposed in an environment that punishes disruption while pretending to value innovation. And if novelty only survives outside the script, where should your attention really go? Because understanding this doesn't end the tension, it sharpens it. And the next move isn't withdrawal or rebellion. It's choosing where unpredictability still exists. And that choice changes everything that follows. Notice when society finally starts praising someone. It's usually after the danger is gone, after the questions stopped, after the person can no longer disrupt anything. Intelligence gets applause only when it's safe, when it can't interfere. Look at how it happens in real time. While someone is alive and thinking freely, they're called impractical, too abstract, not serious. Then years later, their ideas become mandatory reading. Same thoughts, different timing. The threat expired. This pattern isn't accidental. Jung lived it. While he was working, he was sidelined, labeled mystical, unscientific. So he stepped away, built distance, built silence, built the conditions where deep work could exist. The ideas that made him permanent required him to become invisible first. That's the uncomfortable trade most people don't see. Now shift the frame forward. The forces that pushed him away didn't disappear. They multiplied. Today, simplicity is rewarded instantly. Depth is penalized quietly. You don't get attacked. You get ignored. Watch what spreads: short statements, absolute certainty, emotional hooks, clean villains, clean heroes. Now compare that with how intelligent thinking actually works. Conditions, caveats, slow reasoning, unfinished questions. One fits the system, the other doesn't. Here's the risk no one announces. If you don't compress yourself, you disappear from view. If you do compress yourself, you disappear internally. Freedom versus comfort again. Visibility versus coherence. The choice isn't fair, but it's real. This doesn't stop online. Walk into a modern workplace and you'll see the same structure. Innovation is praised in words. Stability is rewarded in action. The moment someone questions the framework, instead of optimizing inside it, tension rises. Labels appear. Not aligned, not collaborative, difficult. The system protects itself without admitting it. Then there are people who see this early, very early. They solve the problem placed in front of them, then refuse the stage that comes with it. Not out of fear, out of clarity. Because the same structure that celebrates the result will demand a performance afterward. Endless explanations, endless appearances, endless dilution. Some choose something else. Silence, distance, authenticity without applause. From the outside, it looks like disappearance. From the inside, it feels like relief. Here's the escalation most don't want to face. Almost every major intellectual shift came from someone who stepped outside the main current. Not temporarily, structurally. They reduced exposure to protect depth. They traded recognition for freedom to think. So the open question isn't why intelligent people vanish. It's why visibility is treated as proof of value in a system that punishes complexity. And if the work that matters most requires invisibility, what kind of presence are you actually optimizing for? Because the real decision isn't about success or failure. It's about whether you want to be seen now or understood later. And that tension doesn't resolve itself. It waits for your next move. Look closely at when the real work happened. Not on stages, not in crowds, in quiet rooms. During interruptions the world called disasters. When the noise dropped and nothing demanded performance. Newton worked while the city shut down. Darwin walked the same paths for years. Kant barely left his town. Dickinson wrote while the world forgot she existed. Tesla fed pigeons while the future used his ideas without him noticing. None of this looks glamorous when it's happening, only later. That detail matters more than people admit. Because while they were alive, these minds weren't celebrated. They were ignored, tolerated at best, left alone when they stopped being useful. Recognition arrived safely after the threat was gone. That pattern doesn't end. It repeats. Here's the uncomfortable shift. If you see yourself in this pattern, you're probably not broken. You're early. Early in a process most people never name. The slow pull away from environments that drain instead of feed you. Notice the signals. After social time, you feel empty, not energized. Invitations feel heavy instead of exciting. You choose books, walks, thinking over gatherings without guilt. At work, you perform well but feel detached. In conversations, you say less. Not because you lack thoughts, but because explaining feels like lifting weight for no result. And when you're alone, something surprising happens. Relief. That moment confuses people, so they label it quickly. Depression, burnout, withdrawal. But pause before you accept that frame. Try a different experiment. What if this isn't decline? What if it's demand? Your mind asking for conditions that actually fit it. Freedom versus comfort again. Social approval versus cognitive clarity. One keeps you visible. The other keeps you functional. Most people choose comfort without noticing. Some don't get that choice for long. There's data behind this, but you don't need numbers to feel it. You already know how certain rooms dull you, how predictable talk drains you, how silence sharpens you. Biology doesn't care about norms. It cares about input. And not every brain thrives on the same diet. This leads to the question most avoid because it's irreversible once asked. If your mind works best away from constant interaction, what happens if you ignore that? And if withdrawal restores strength instead of taking it, what exactly are you withdrawing from? Here's the escalation. Disappearance isn't a single decision. It's a slope. You're already partway down it if you're listening closely. The real choice isn't whether it will happen. It's how. Slowly, unconsciously, with confusion and guilt, or deliberately with structure and intent. Because stepping back without strategy looks like loss. Stepping back with awareness looks like construction. And that distinction decides whether disappearance becomes decay or leverage. That's where this actually begins. It starts as a small decision. You cancel one meeting. You skip one gathering. You choose silence over explaining yourself again. And instead of guilt, you feel something else. Relief. That's the moment most people misinterpret. They think something is wrong. But what if something finally aligned? Here's the uncomfortable truth hiding underneath. Staying visible often requires you to fail quietly, to shrink your thinking, to flatten your curiosity, to perform clarity instead of actually having it. You're rewarded for being manageable, not for being accurate. And if you keep playing that role long enough, the failure is guaranteed. Not professional failure, personal failure, failure to become who you actually are. Now shift the frame. Disappearing isn't running away from failure. It's stepping out of a system designed to produce it. Treat withdrawal like a strategic move, not an emotional one. Essential versus noise, authentic work versus acceptable performance. One leads to applause, the other leads to substance. Jung lived this choice publicly and paid for it privately. After the break that isolated him, he didn't rush to repair his image. He built distance instead. Physical distance, mental distance. Space where no one demanded simplicity from him. And in that space, the ideas that changed psychology finally had room to form, not despite the withdrawal, because of it. Here's a practical way to test this for yourself. Look at what you actually lose when you step back. Conversations that never go anywhere, politics that drain without building anything, performances for people who don't really see you, approval that costs too much to maintain. Now look at what quietly returns. Time, focus, depth, the ability to think without translating every thought into something safe. This isn't romantic, it's efficient. Deep work needs insulation, clarity needs quiet. Freedom needs serenity, distance from constant evaluation. And most environments can't provide that without resistance. So when the pull toward withdrawal shows up, don't panic, observe it, experiment with it. Reduce exposure instead of announcing exits. Build space instead of burning bridges. Comfort versus freedom again. One keeps you busy, the other keeps you honest. People around you may worry. They'll call it concerning. They'll say you're isolating, stepping back, wasting potential. That's predictable. What matters is what happens inside you when the noise drops. Whether your thinking sharpens, whether your energy returns. whether your work starts to feel real again. Because here's the escalation most don't reach. Disappearing isn't leaving life, it's entering it without an audience, without a script, without the need to explain yourself prematurely, and the work that comes from that place doesn't look impressive at first. It looks quiet, invisible, almost empty, until it isn't. And that's the part most people never stay long enough to see. Notice how often you make yourself smaller without being asked. You soften a point, you skip a thought, you choose silence because it keeps the room calm, it feels polite, it feels mature. But there's a quiet cost you don't calculate in the moment. You leave parts of yourself unused. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The world is already full of people reducing themselves to keep others comfortable. It doesn't need another one. And if you're honest, you feel the friction when you do it. The sense that something essential is being traded for approval, comfort versus capacity, ease versus depth. So shift the frame. Don't think of withdrawal as rejection. Treat it like preparation, an experiment in removing what compresses you. Less explanation, less performance, more space to operate at full strength. Not forever, just long enough to see what happens when nothing interrupts your thinking. This is where practicality appears. When you step back, notice what drains immediately stop draining. Conversations that go nowhere, roles that reward sameness, relationships that take more than they give. You don't need to dramatize it, just reduce exposure. Noise fades faster than you expect. What replaces it isn't emptiness, it's clarity. Time stretches, thoughts finish themselves. Ideas connect without being rushed into something presentable. Freedom versus comfort again. One keeps you busy, the other lets you build. This is what people miss when they talk about disappearing. The ones who stepped away didn't vanish because they couldn't survive society. They stepped away because surviving there required sacrificing what mattered most. They chose invisibility over distortion. And in that quiet, their real work began. There's a risk here, and it's honest to name it. When you withdraw, people will misunderstand. They'll say you're isolating, giving up, falling behind. That's predictable. What matters is what happens inside the space you create. Whether your energy returns, whether your thinking deepens, whether the work you care about finally has room. Here's the open question you can't answer from inside the noise. What would you produce if no one was watching, if nothing needed to be explained, if your only standard was internal coherence, not external approval? Because visibility in a distorted environment isn't success, it's participation. And stepping away from that distortion isn't failure, it's alignment. The work done there won't look impressive at first. It won't trend. It won't be noticed by the people who prefer simplicity. But that's the point. Disappearing isn't about hiding from the world. It's about finally meeting yourself without interference. And once that happens, the work that follows doesn't need permission. That's where it actually starts.